Joining me now live from London to discuss the global markets is William Attwell, practice leader at Sub-Saharan Africa, Duckerfrontier. So start off with the China perspective there. You heard in the news that there were ever-increasing concerns there about the coronavirus. How do you see it impacting on the supply chains around the world?
Well, it's going to be very serious indeed. You mentioned how Coca-Cola is looking at its impact on its earnings, and our surveys of companies have really indicated that a lot of companies haven't taken the full impact into account. I think a lot of analysts are still grappling with what the implications of the disruptions are going to be. We've shaved a full half a percentage point off our China growth forecast, and obviously that's going to have a huge impact on markets that export to China, particularly commodity exporters in parts of Africa. But of course, the supply chain impacts are going to be felt across the world, and we're already seeing manufacturers in Europe and, of course, in Southeast Asia as well being affected, finding they are lacking certain components that they use in their production processes. And I think just the way that supply chains have become so globally integrated, and the way that companies have become increasingly reliant on just-in-time delivery of their inputs means that this is going to be very disruptive indeed.
And you were saying 0.5% off growth rate there. Some of the predictions at the start of this outbreak was for more than 1%. How convinced are you that it's not going to go any higher than it already is in cutting from the Chinese growth rate?
Well, we're obviously going to have to watch very carefully what happens through the course of Q1. We'll start to see some data coming out, at least for January and February, eventually pointing to what these implications are going to be. A lot's going to depend on how the outbreak is contained. Of course, those outbreaks in prisons are very concerning. And the new cases we've been seeing in South Korea, for instance, showing that actually it's still spreading and authorities haven't fully got this out under control. However, of course, we know that the death rates are still relatively low, but of course, it's the containment efforts that really have the economic impact. So we're going to have to see what happens in terms of how governments respond, flights cancelled, the impact on tourism. All of that is going to play out in the next weeks and months, and that will start to create a fuller picture for what the true impact on 2020 is going to be.
Now, from the coronavirus to the world of post-Brexit. Now, I understand there's a big clash looming among member states in the Eurozone over budget.
Of course. So, one of the largest contributors, the UK, stepping away from the EU and, leaving a large UK-sized hole in the EU budget, and of course they're planning into the future. So this is sort of goes beyond the UK's contributions that it's going to make as part of its divorce deal. So we have a big battle lining up, of course, between those countries that are looking to provide a bit of fiscal stimulus to their economies, looking at, of course, the impact of the slowing Chinese growth, and looking at ways to compensate for that through stimulus measures. And then on the other side of the table, you have the so-called frugal four economies, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, who want to contain budgetary spending and their contributions they make to the EU and to the Commission. So we're lining up for a big battle, and of course, Brexit has made this much harder.
Yeah, and there is a theory running around still post-Brexit that Britain's exit from the European Union might lead to a further breakup of the European Union itself as other nations look to go in future.
It's not an impossibility. Of course, I mean, these are very integrated economies. You can see how, it's been 3 years, the UK trying to untangle itself, and it's still not done yet. But of course, there's very strong anti-EU sentiment in places like France and in Italy. And so, populist parties there are certainly, going to be riding that bandwagon going forward. So we're going to have to see what happens in future elections in places like France and Italy, and see who comes to power and what they can wield in terms of their engagement with the EU going forward. But very low probability for the time being.
At Q4 numbers, looking here, point to a weak 2020 for US and Africa. How are you reading that one?
Yeah. So of course we've been seeing the Q4 numbers coming out of Stats SA, pointing to a rather bleak time for manufacturing and mining, for instance, and not very different the European numbers. I think many were hoping that those economies would start to pick up towards the end of the year, but unfortunately that hasn't happened. And so we've actually downgraded our outlook, particularly for the Eurozone economies. Their industrial sectors actually performing worse than expected, and we expect that their pretty flat performance to continue into the rest of this year.
And also, US Secretary of State going to go for a 3-country tour here in Africa. Again, raises this question. We're talking about China, talking about the US, and I've reported from this continent for more than a quarter of a century. And I honestly think that in many ways, the US has been a bit, should we say, negligent in its policy towards Africa and trying to catch up now. China's making strong inroads into the continent.
Yeah. So certainly, China's been very ambitious in terms of Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of the big loan commitments that it's made to African governments for infrastructure projects, for instance. And there is a certain element of catch-up happening here. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was in Ethiopia just recently, and pledging more support to really help the Prime Minister drive forward his economic reform program there. So we're going to see, of course, how this plays out in terms of whether this gets the US any more traction with African governments. Africa hasn't been at the top of the foreign policy priority list for the Trump administration. So perhaps as it starts to work through some of its other issues, it's beginning to look at Africa in a little bit more strategic light.
Well, on that note, I wonder what happened to Power Africa in Barack Obama's time. A lot of talk about it. When I asked US state officials at WEF a couple of years ago, you'd have thought I was asking about something that didn't matter at all. Yeah. I don't know whether you think it's going to make a comeback.
Probably not for the time being. I think the Trump administration, if anything, despite this visit by Pompeo, is really looking at ways to stimulate private sector activity and create opportunities for American companies to enter African markets and sell more, rather than spending money itself on things like big security commitments or big power projects. So that's a big shift in emphasis, I think.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Live to us from London, that was William Attwell, practice leader at Sub-Saharan Africa for Duckerfrontier.